Welcome everyone to today's AI ethics seminar. Our speaker today is Anders Sandberg from the University of Oxford, and he will talk about law, AI, and Leviathan. Most welcome, Anders.
Thank you so much for inviting me over, and yeah, I'm sorry I can't be physically over in Gothenburg yet. Practical reality being what it is, but
we had this great guest program in 2017 where you were the main visiting professor, and that was great. And this is your first thing at Chalmers since
yes.
then. It's great to have you back.
Yep, and indeed I have a Chalmers souvenir and a sweater, which I unfortunately forgot to wear for this moment. But anyway, the reason I'm giving this talk is that I'm working on a book together with, let me see if I can get this right. So, okay, I think you can see my slides now. I'm working on a book together with Cyril Holm at Karlstad University. And the reason for this is that back in 2020, Cyril was guest professor here in Oxford. Normally, this is a very nice thing to do, and Oxford is a beautiful city, and it's nice to be a guest professor, except this was 2020, lockdown. So we ended up sitting across in my garden at a socially distant distance, shouting research ideas at each other. And we ended up writing a little paper based on the question, what about handling global and big disasters? What does it take for society to do that? What are the limits to that process, and how might AI affect this situation? The little problem turned out to be that that paper was a mess. So finally we realized we can't compress it into a perfect two-page summary. Instead, we might have to dilute it into the shape of a book, which is currently happening. So basically, the core question that got us started is saving the world requires global coordination, and that might actually threaten individuality and autonomy. So how do you balance this, especially when AI is getting involved? So a good method for talking about your talk is, of course, to bring up what you're going to say, and then in a compressed form. So when you fall asleep, you can then later on maybe remember this. But the basic summary is something like this. Why do we have laws, markets, and similar big social institutions? Well, you could argue that they're giving us peace and prosperity. Some people gain a lot of power from them. They're basically helping to promote this kind of prosperity by solving coordination problems that would otherwise be rather hard for us to solve. And they give us various tools for handling this. And it turns out that some of these things actually happen as a kind of distributed cognition between our brains. We are boundedly rational, but our autonomous actions, given some of the peculiarities of humans liking to follow rules other humans set up, etc., generate this emergent system that is quite good at providing peace and prosperity. That's great. It also turns out that there is a real problem here. And that is designing systems like this is fairly tricky. So if you set out to construct this kind of distributed cognition among a lot of people, it's easy to make something that doesn't work very well. And a case study here might be the failures of planned economies. That ought to have been rationally planned, but it turned out to be a pretty big disaster. So that's an interesting demonstration that it's not entirely trivial to construct these systems. Now, we also have this consideration that we might actually want to coordinate much more in the future. The world is rather messy. It might be that very dangerous and powerful techniques are emerging or are already here. And it seems to be clear that in order to handle questions like nuclear proliferation and climate change and the right use of artificial intelligence and biotechnology and a long list of other things, we want much stronger forms of global coordination. And this is a concept that Nick Bostrom wrote about under the term of singletons. That's why I'm going to be using this concept of natural intelligence singletons and artificial intelligence singletons with lowercase s. But that term is crappy and bad, so don't remember it too well. We are going to change it in the final book, but for historical reasons, we're calling it that. And if you come up with a better term, please give us an idea about it. Because the interesting possibility here might be that these systems we have in society that we actually outsource cognition to, of course, some of them can be done by software. Indeed, we love outsourcing a lot of our cognition to our software and hardware around us. And quite often this is very practical and very useful. And then we might indeed get a lot more in prosperity and safety. But the problem is that those kind of systems don't necessarily need to run on human autonomy. And that means that we might end up in this awkward situation where we get all the material wealth and the peace we want, but we're not in charge of anything. And that might be bad. Some people would immediately say, oh, this sounds really horrifying. So that's why we called it the serfdom conclusion. Cyril and me are both a bit of fans of Friedrich Hayek and his famous book, The Road to Serfdom. And we have been waving it around a little bit. But the general question is, of course, are there a way of having the cake and eating it? Can we actually have prosperity and autonomy and getting global safety from existential risks? So that is really what we're trying to resolve in this book after many, many detours. But that is generally what I'm going to be talking about. And hopefully this can then be compressed into some conclusions. We still have our doubts that we're going to reach a neat conclusion here. It rather looks like here are a few interesting desiderata we can work on. All right. So first, we would start with a detour into metaethics. And I don't quite know about you, how many of you are active philosophers who think that metaethics is the coolest and best thing ever, or more practical engineers who think this is just messy and airy-fairy stuff where philosophers go on about truth and beauty and how many normative angels can dance on the head of a virtuous pin. But for us, we need to start with a chapter just about this, because there is this interesting thing that the Swedish legal scholars, and Cyril is a professor of jurisprudence, they generally tend to be rather heavy into legal realism and legal positivism. That is, what is a law? Does it exist? And quite a lot of people say, of course we have laws because we want justice, some moral principle that is supposedly existing outside the human world. And of course, when you start trying to find where can I find a sample of this justice, it's rather hard. Actually, it doesn't seem to be any physical thing that corresponds to justice. And even trying to say it's a state of a world that is just, it immediately gets very complicated. So there was this big debate in the Scandinavian legal scholarship the last century that led to Axel Hegerström's ideas that laws should be scientific. We should be studying law from a scientific perspective. That means we can't deal with stuff we can never observe. We can read the legal texts, we can look at what people do, but we can't say this is having a lot of justice in it. So instead, you should be just to be a naturalist. You should look at actual nature. And this leads to legal positivism. Laws are what gets implemented, no matter what the moral worth is. We might want Parliament to pass nice laws that are good in some higher sense. But in practice, we can only talk about what is it they're saying and how does it get implemented. Why are we even bringing this up, besides making the people in the law faculty happy? Well, the interesting part here is that quite a lot of this leads over to an error theory. So error theory is a part of metaethical theories about what ethics is, that says that ethical statements are wrong. When I say murder is wrong, it's an erroneous statement, just like saying murder is right. They're not pointing at anything. That wrong and right in those sentences can't really properly point at something. You can be an error theorist and a total nihilist saying that all ethics talk is just nonsense. Or you could be a relativist and say, actually, in this society, it's wrong to kill people, but that other society is fine with it. Or you can say, oh, it's your personal view, Anders. You're expressing your subjective feeling that you really dislike murder. And I might even agree with that feeling, but it still doesn't have any validity. The point about error theory is that now we share away a lot of the interest in metaphysics that most of us who are in ethics would say is actually important. But the cool part here is if Cyril and me can make arguments that actually work without referring to any of the fancier stuff, just keeping to this error theoretical view that we are having laws in order to reach peace and prosperity as practical goods, then presumably you might, if you think that we actually have some other moral principles, say that, okay, those other arguments are still valid, but I'm adding extra arguments. I might say that autonomy has an intrinsic value instead of just being instrumentally useful for reaching some conclusion. You might say that, yeah, I'm a consequentialist and I'm going to be maximizing some good across the world. But if it's practically true that certain things happen if you do certain things, that's a very relevant part of a calculation. So this is why we end up with this. So when we are talking about morals in this context, we're not really thinking of them as the fancy stuff, but rather they're practical prescriptions. That you don't steal, that is a useful thing and a useful behavior. That lack of stealing makes a lot of things work better. People get along much better when we're not stealing from each other. You can say that the economy is much more stable because you have property rights. Anyway, that is kind of where we're coming from. And this is perhaps mostly of interest to philosophers. But then, of course, the philosophers also need to be confronted with the practicalities of what kind of creatures are we? And I think one of the most interesting aspects is that we are rather stupid. Yet we're also social beings. One of the tricks our species have for surviving well is, of course, to actually coordinate. We have shared intentions that are very useful. Certainly, various animals form groups and go out and do joint things, like chimpanzees and fishes forming big schools. But humans can sit down around the campfire and say, tomorrow we're going to go hunting mammoths. And then we can make up a plan. And we can even say, then we go in different directions and you get to improvise if this part of the plan doesn't work. And afterwards, we're going to share the meat in this way. So there is no quarrel. What we have then done is that we created this interesting shared intention across the entire tribe. So when we go off and hunt the mammoth, it's not just the mammoth is getting kind of overwhelmed by these coordinated little monkeys with spears coming from all directions that also have planned for contingencies. We are also very motivated to follow the plan because we know that if I do my part, I'm going to have meat tonight. So we are very successful in doing this, and this is really great, except that we're not terribly good at coordinating. We're better than many animals, partially because we have big brains and intelligence and language, which are amazing things. But we also have this problem that we actually are both stupid and selfish. So the stupidity part is that my intelligence is probably not enough to figure out what all the other people around me are going to do. Some of that is just lack of information, but quite often it might be that I can't see all these extra steps that are needed to follow what they're going to do. And quite often, I'm not even able to do a simple plan. I plan for something, and it just turns out that I was too stupid to do it well. And then the overall group plan might fall apart. But there is another problem, and that is, of course, selfishness. I'm motivated to get a lot of the spoils. Maybe I want to give it to my near and dear, but that might still be more than what the rest of the tribe would like me to have. So there is this problem of balancing our own interest versus a group interest. And again, here you can get into anthropology and anthropology of morality and find that many of the moral rules we have are very much constructed to try to resolve this. If you go and look at fairy tales, quite a lot of their conclusions are all about being pro-social in the right way. Because we need good stories to motivate ourselves to be pro-social enough, because it's so easy to slip into that selfish behavior and then things fall apart. But the really interesting thing is that we also seems to be that we are normative animals. So when we get told that it's wrong to do something, we actually tend to react to that in a different way from hearing that something is the case or not the case. We start thinking that maybe I should feel guilt if I'm doing that wrong thing. We tend to pick up on moral signals quite strongly. And this is really interesting. Why are we doing that? And again, you can give a very simple instrumental reason. This is a good way of shoring up those group intentions. And we can even imagine kind of an evolutionary story for having different tribes having different levels of sensitivity to obeying normative strictures. Generally, for example, we have this fun book, The Secret of Our Success, which is entirely out of our focus, by Joseph Heinrich, which is mostly about how we distribute our culture. A lot of information about how to survive in our environment is stored in our culture, and then we tend to copy this relatively blindly. And this is usually a smart move, because you can't use the scientific method if you're a Stone Age tribe hunting mammoths. You don't have resources enough to try different modes of mammoth hunting very much. So it's better to just follow the rules, which might include a lot of random ceremonies and rituals that you just randomly got, but you can't tell them apart from the important things. So it's better that everybody obey them. And it's also a good test, of course, for checking that people are listening to the rules of the tribe, to see that we follow the rituals. Even if you don't believe that you need to spin around 3 times with your spear before going on mammoth hunt, if you notice somebody else not doing it, you know that he's not taking this seriously. He's probably not going to think about the safety rules either. So there are interesting signalings going on. And at this point, of course, sociologists will smugly say, yeah, we know a few things about this. Institutions. Because as that Stone Age tribe becomes larger, we get agriculture, we get cities, we get big societies. We invent a lot of structures. And these structures, these social structures, are very, very powerful. So the interesting things with an institution is that they provide us with rules for our behavior. And some of them are explicit rules we formally agree on. So I signed a contract when I joined Oxford University, so I know a certain set of rules for behaving here. And I also have a whole bunch of norms that I just get by being part of a culture here. There are no strict rules about how to behave as an Oxford academic in that sense, but many of them are almost as constricting, or perhaps even more constricting, than the explicit rules in the contract. And this, of course, goes for anything. Sociologists would say that language itself is a form of institution. What Cyril and me are interested in here, and is going to be relevant for AI later, that is that some of these institutions act as extended cognition. We actually outsource a lot of our cognition to them, and we give them normative power. By being part of something, you're supposed to be doing certain things. And this becomes very easy. Quite often as academics, we feel like we talk like, as an academic, I will do this and that. Because now your self-image is tied to being part of this normative framework of what a good academic is supposed to be doing. And this, of course, leads to all sorts of fun stuff. Because generally, we have these collective mental states and beliefs. That collective intention is quite powerful. But it also seems like we use these institutions to extend our cognitive capacity. So some of you might know about Clark and Chalmers' the extended mind hypothesis. They posited that our thinking does not just happen inside our brains. If we are regularly using notebooks or smartphones or other things to do the same operations that if they happen inside a brain, we would say are part of cognition or feeling, then they should probably be regarded as part of cognition and feeling. It's just that they are located a little bit outside the skull, or quite far away these days, because they're probably residing in the clouds somewhere. I discovered that a lot of my memory, a lot of what I believed I knew, was Wikipedia. I discovered this when I was in China. It was censored, and I suddenly became aware how often I unconsciously looked up stuff on Wikipedia. Suddenly it didn't work, and I felt much more stupid, and I also recognized that this is a part of what I kind of thought was my set of knowledge beliefs that were actually edited by various editors around the world in a big organization. And similarly, Chalmers and Clark, they bring up courts as an example of another form of this extended cognition. Here you have various roles. Not everybody needs to know all the kinds of evidence or law to make a court work. So we outsource this to our brains, social structures, and pieces of paper. And this can work really well. Rule of law is something that makes our lives go rather well. But this is not just about having a laws that make sense and law enforcement that really work, but that we also have common knowledge as citizens that actually you can trust the law and the police, and they know that we know, and I know that you know. So we all know together roughly what can be expected of a legal system. Without that, it's not going to work that well, even though you might very well have totally fine judges and policemen and laws, but if nobody trusts them, it's actually not going to work. It only starts working really well when it actually runs in our own brains. In many ways, we are our own policemen. Quite often, when we're even considering doing something illegal, we think, oh, that's wrong. Why do we think it's wrong? Well, we heard a lot of stories about how immoral it is to do wrong things. We have stories about criminals getting caught. We have systems like reputations that keep us on the straight and narrow. And this is, of course, really great. And here we could really stop. Cyril and me could write an entire book about this, and it would probably be regarded as a middling book among sociologists because, yeah, it's not entirely new. All these ideas are already out there. The interesting thing that happens here is, of course, that we might now start thinking about how this could move over into software. It's also worth noticing that I've been giving this kind of nice story about, yes, we get peace and prosperity out of having this shared normativity. We set up these institutions, they help us function, and everything goes well. And at this point, of course, many people say, yeah, but there are also sociopaths out there. There are a lot of self-serving people who like to take power. And the power is really the ability to make another person do what I want, and they would not otherwise choose to do. And it is kind of a bad thing for others because it allows manipulation of people to do something that is not aligned with their interests. Sometimes this can be for the best. Sometimes a parent needs to drag a screaming kid to the dentist. But quite a lot of the power we see in institutional society, we are suspicious of, and rightly so, because a lot of that is just good for the people seeking power. So the problem is, of course, these extended systems also need to develop various forms of protections, not just because of the sociopaths, but also because some of the power seekers that are inside the system, they also want to protect their positions. Indeed, this is a little bit similar to one of the theories of emergence of government. If you have mobile bandits, they're stealing resources from other people. They don't have any incentive to leave anything behind from the village they ransack. They can just burn it down. But if a bandit stays in the village, he's still going to be exploiting the poor villagers, but he's going to be rather keen on not burning it down because he likes the house. And he also soon realized that, oh no, they're bandits trying to take my village from me. I need to defend it. So this is Vancouver Olson's story about how the governments and governance to some extent has emerged. One can realize that there's probably a bit of a mixture of this. There are evidence that actually support both sides, and at different times and places, these different factors come in. But again, you get institutions that are both kind of trying to defend themselves and optimize for things functioning well. And really well-designed societies, or rather well-emerged societies, they give a lot of peace and prosperity, and maybe also diffuses the power seekers into getting them into political careers where they do less damage while actually promoting things for the society. Okay, so far so good. So we end up with this kind of normative iceberg, as Cyril and me call it. So on top of it, we have this legible structure. We have explicit laws, the contracts that we know about. And then we have this thing under the waterline. A lot of these systems are just grown. And this is, of course, where important things are going on. There is a lot of questions, for example, how do you divide shared goods in a society? And for a long time, people were very concerned about the tragedy of commons. If people can just exploit things freely, it's going to break down. We need to have explicit rules and property ownership to manage that. And Elinor Ostrom, got the Nobel Prize for pointing out that actually quite a lot of societies solve this with a lot of institutions that don't even seem to be about protecting the stability of society. They look like weird religious traditions or bureaucratic rules about what the family is allowed to fish on what day outside the harbor. But it turns out that over time, there has emerged this set of traditions that actually are a way of dividing things effectively. But this is not constructed by people being very clever and sitting down and doing an optimization. But this is constructed because these particular habits actually help handle things. That might range from using divination, using birds to determine who's going to plant the crops on what fields. This is known from New Guinea. And it seems like what actually is going on is the birds act as a randomizer. You using a mixed strategy of planting either in the very fertile but occasionally flooded valleys or the more stable but perhaps less productive upper slopes. So if you just randomize it year by year, it's fair enough. All families they get on average a good return, and it's also more less likely that you are going to be hit by a flood several times in a row. So in this iceberg, we sit with the designed structures on the top. We have a lot of grown structures on the bottom. Some of these are normative. We have on top, we have laws and rules, and at the bottom, we have various social norms we have. The things that make us frown when somebody is talking in the wrong way on the phone in the subway, or over here in England, of course, somebody who is not queuing in the right way. After all, queue jumping is the most serious crime on the British Isles. And the most fascinating part for me to see is that every October, I see students coming from other cultures not queuing right. And just like all the other Brits, I'm kind of mildly frowning at them. But of course, nobody ever says anything. By December, the students are all queuing correctly. They got the social cues by a lot of Brits kind of not looking at them and sending elbows in vaguely in the right direction to hint that this is something as antisocial. That's all it takes for us to pick up these norms. And by now, of course, the Italians are also queuing just like the rest of us. So this works quite often. Sometimes it can go badly wrong. You can actually get lock-in of totally disruptive and destructive systems. But when the society works well, we get this big system. And then we end up with what Surami called the natural intelligence singleton. It's actually several different layers. The market system is separate from the legal system, but they're of course relying on each other. The different parts of the iceberg are kind of leaning on each other. So we're essentially living inside these vast cognitive artifacts. And we are interested in the ones that are kind of having these normative effects on us, not just existing as like language or existing as a family, which are important social structures and social institutions, but we're not pushing this normative agenda on our behavior. And they also seem to emerge from a lot of individual autonomous actions. Sometimes we go together in meetings and decide that this is how to do it. Sometimes we actually just let things emerge. This is, of course, where Hayek was happily to talk about spontaneous orders. And you might say that this is perhaps what the invisible hand of the market actually is. It is that we get these structures, and once they're well functioning, we tend to keep them, and it works rather well. And they do align the individual gain with social rationality without central direction, which is kind of what Adam Smith really wanted to get out of it. Okay, so far so good. And now, of course, we can say, yeah, but couldn't we use modern game theory and mathematics and fix this? And this slide should be relabeled. This is not about the problems of socialism. It's about the problems of planned economies. But I forgot to fix this before this presentation. So apologies to socialists. I still disagree with socialism, but this is all about planned economy. And it's an interesting problem. How, if we can use mathematics and game theory, couldn't we run the economy better? And there is, of course, a classic critique you get from Hayek and Mises about, well, it's hard to get the information aggregated in the right way. And I think they won the debate. The socialists will, of course, never admit that. But a lot of that debate was really more about values and the liberal society. And since we're running on error theory here, we can ignore all that fairness stuff. We can just look at the question, well, can you actually distribute goods so everybody gets happy enough? And it's an interesting issue because you can reformulate this as a computational complexity critique. And now we're finally getting over a little bit more to computer science. Indeed, it turns out that you could view an economy as a kind of linear programming problem. An actual economy isn't a linear programming problem, but let's assume that it is. It's much harder if it's not a linear programming problem. Already in 1927, Pareto actually in a textbook pointed out that there are probably more than 70,699 conditions on the equation system describing the economy. And obviously, there's not enough pen and paper to solve that at all. So long before computers were even a gleam in Alan Turing's eye, he kind of understood that there was a complexity limit here. Now, the funny thing is, over the decades since then, we have actually discovered a fair bit about computational complexity theory. And in some technical sense, you could say that actually doing a linear program is a total tractable problem, because the time complexity is only polynomial in the number of variables and conditions on them. So how hard could it be? And indeed, people in the Soviet Union and others, here's another very nice book about, let's see if I can. It's Red Plenty by Francis Spufford, which is a kind of a fictionalized story about the attempts at cybernizing the Soviet economy. And the basic realization was, well, you can't solve it with pen and paper, but no problem. We have computers. We can just run it as a big linear equation system and then handle it. And the reason it failed in the Soviet Union had relatively little to do with computational complexity. There was a lot of other human nature and politics and bureaucracy involved. But it also seems like the best algorithm we have a time complexity about the number of goods to the power of 2.5. This is tractable in the sense that it's polynomial. But if you actually try to calculate how many goods there are in the world, you realize that Amazon has an inventory of about 12 million items, with about 350 million items in the marketplace sellers list. And I think for each of these objects, we should assume that there are many, many more that need to exist over in the factories and manufacturing processes for them. So my guesstimate is that we're on the order of 1 billion variables or more in a developed economy right now. That's a big N. And also, we probably need to multiply this with the number of locations, because obviously the food in one location is not entirely comparable to food in another location. And actually, we might need to include services. And at this point, we get a ridiculously large number. So I end up with geological timescales for solving this. At this point, I might say, haha, liberalism wins yet again. And my socialist friends will immediately say, what about parallel computers? And they don't shave off enough, it turns out. What about fast matrix multiplication? That might shave off a small factor. It might turn it to n to the power of 2 plus 1/18 in the most extreme case. What about quantum computers? Doesn't seem to apply very well to these algorithms, but they generally at least generate a square root speed up. Well, what about some other approaches? Generally, it seems like the best approach is decentralized economic planning. You separate the parts of economy into subsystems that are not connected so strongly to each other and solve them. And then it becomes a little bit more tractable. If you do this enough, you end up with basically an approximation that is a market, but implemented as a computer program with shadow prices and all of that. So at this point, I might be feeling rather smug as a free marketeer. Then, unfortunately, I read more papers and realized that we actually have a lot of weird results in economics that from a computational complexity perspective are really horrifying. There is a hilarious paper showing that the efficient market hypothesis implies that P equals MP in computational complexity. This, to an economist, doesn't sound too bad, but I think to a computer scientist implies, okay, the efficient market hypothesis probably cannot be true. And the economist goes, why? I think it's a pretty good approximation. Yeah, but we are pretty certain P is not equal to MP over at my department. The ensuing debates tend to be hilarious. The real problem in that case seems to be that the efficient market hypothesis assumes that markets adopt instantly to new information. And obviously, they cannot. There are light speed limitations, physical limitations. So we might say, okay, false alarm, that was just annoying. But then it turns out that finding game theoretic equilibrium, that is an NP complete. And much of standard economics is all based on the assumption that we have converged to an equilibrium, and then we can start talking about prices and all that. Indeed, there are some demonstrations that price formation ought to take exponential time. And this is kind of annoying because we obviously notice when we go to the store that prices don't take eons to stabilize. They stabilize very quickly. It turns out that there are some interesting papers showing that for the kind of production function and utility function actual people have, then convergence happens in roughly quadratic time, which is fast enough that, yeah, this works. Similarly, there are various other theorems, like the wonderfully named Sonnenschein-Mantel-de-Broglie theorem, showing that actually you can get multiple equilibria, which really scare economists and don't scare people in other sciences, because we're kind of used to having multiple equilibria. So the end result is something like, okay, this on paper looks dangerous, but in practice we just approximate things well enough by doing little local market interactions, and that converges. You could argue that we're doing a kind of stochastic gradient descent, basically, to find the prices and production that makes sense. Indeed, one of my little side projects is trying to write a paper showing in how much you can show an equivalence between a feed-forward neural network and a supply chain. Turns out to be some awkward mathematical differences that made this paper harder to write than I would like, but you can actually find some mappings, at least for some toy models. So the interesting thing is that we seem to be living inside a market that is this kind of grown non-material epistemic artifact. Cool. And at this point, of course, I still feel smug until my cyber socialist friend says, yeah, Anders, but if you're allowed to use those approximations, we are allowed to. And then we're going to go back to how much of that planning actually can be approximated well. Now, the interesting part here is that Herbert Simon pointed out many years ago that if you look at an entire economy, actually quite large chunks of economy are not at all a market. They're companies, they're organizations, and they're actually running a little internal planned economy. Between them, there is a lot of connections of actual market. And this is, of course, tied to a long-running debate about the nature of a firm. Why do they have companies when everybody could just be independent contractors? And the standard answer that you get from Coase is, yeah, but the transaction cost, it's so messy to make new deals all the time, so it's better to bundle things together inside an organization. How big can that organization get? Well, if it gets too big, it's too hard to coordinate among all the people. So there is this interesting discussion here where Cesar Hidalgo from MIT did some nice work on economic complexity. And there is basically this understanding that we have this network of planned institutions and solving some problems relatively efficiently, and then the market solves other problems efficiently. But here's the interesting thing that Simon pointed out. The balance between them seems to be relatively sensitive to how easy it is to coordinate a lot of people and how easy it is to get economies of scale. So the outcome of a debate between me and my socialist friends, that is kind of mostly about what is the current state of this balance. But now we start adding AI. And that seems to be where you might actually expect things to change quite a bit. Now, this is not necessarily good news for my cyber socialist friend, because the biggest planned economy in the world is Walmart. Walmart is bigger than many countries, and it's very successful. And you could imagine that maybe with the right kind of coordination, it could just become big enough to encompass the world economy. And probably both me and my friend would say, that was not entirely what we wanted. But it shows that there is something interesting that might be going on here. And also why AI might have really big effects by just changing the price of coordination a little bit. So that has, of course, a lot of both safety and ethics implications that might be interesting. Anyway, I'm definitely behind the schedule here. So I'm going to scurry over existential risk, because Olle is much more eloquent and good at talking about existential risk than I am. But this is, of course, the wine of the house over here at FHI. We are very interested in thinking about how bad are they? Are they uniquely bad, so they totally dominate anything, or could we compare them to other disasters? And what risks exist? How do they change over time? And one of the findings is, of course, quite clear, that they have a big governance angle. Preventing existential threats to humanity requires great coordination globally, and quite a lot of them come from bad coordination. But this is, of course, a bit worrisome, because if we're getting more powerful technologies and need more coordination, this might be bad. Nick Bostrom has written a really annoying paper about what he calls the vulnerable world hypothesis, where he argues that maybe there are even doomsday technology or doomsday questions, but maybe there is an easy way of blowing up planets. We haven't found it yet, but one day somebody finds it. And if it's an easy way, it might be easy to spread, or others might independently rediscover that. So in Nick's paper, he pointed out that we were kind of lucky that it was hard to make a nuclear chain reaction. Maybe it would just have required a battery, a few pieces of glass, in which case Leo Szilard could literally have spread the news that would have destroyed civilization. And generally, handling that kind of information hazard-like threat might definitely require something different from the current anarchic world order. Now, this, of course, has led to the locus classicus of thinking about it. So Thomas Hobbes, back during the British Civil War in the 1600s, he kind of felt like the state of nature is really bad. It's everybody's war against everybody. And it's rational to give up autonomy to a strong, undivided government. And he was a royalist, so he was, of course, imagining that to be the sovereign, the king. And in his famous frontispiece, he has this kind of group intelligence forming the king. Although he believed the king should be a person, the king, the Leviathan, is supported actually by everybody agreeing that it's better to have a king than having chaos and anarchy. And you find a lot of people essentially having a similar idea as the previous ideas, that, oh dear, you need to have some central agency to coordinate. Otherwise, you get conflicts, and that's bad. It goes back all the way to Dante himself, the guy with the Divine Comedy. He actually wrote a bit about monarchy too. And after Hobbes, of course, a lot of people have been talking about the ideal state and even the idea of the need for a world state. Most recently, Torbjörn Tännsjö came out with a book where he basically says climate change is so bad that we need not just a world government, but probably a climate despot. That is pushing things rather far, but could this be a non-human? And again, Nick has an old paper where he talks about the singleton, this hypothetical world order where it's a single decision-making agents at the highest level. And it would then be able to both prevent other threats from unseating it and exert effective control over its domain. And the reason he was bringing it up was, this is a hypothetical way humanity could survive. We set up a singleton. Maybe that's United Nations plus. Maybe that is Tännsjö's climate despot, or maybe it's an AI program. The question is, could this actually work? And now I don't have the time to talk much about it. There is a lot of interesting cybernetic arguments here. There are obvious moral and safety arguments, because a bad singleton is super bad. But there is also an interesting problem of, could you even have a superintelligence running the world? If we truly believed in the almighty power of market to be smarter than anything, then it would seem that it might not be able to coordinate smarter than the market. I think some of the computational complexity argument seems to suggest that actually maybe a sufficiently big singleton could do it. However, there are also computational reasons why that might mean that it's much bigger than the human markets and the human world. So you might end up with a singleton that's basically much bigger than Earth, at least in an intellectual sense. There is a lot of interesting issues here about trade-offs, etc. Anyway, this is the most extreme form of coordination, and this is the reason I was using the term singleton. Again, I'm not going to talk very much about AI because you are already talking about AI. But one interesting thing is when you start trying to be explicit about how could AI really go wrong in an existential way. The classical idea you find, for example, in superintelligence is kind of brute force. Something becomes superintelligence, it has the wrong kind of goals, and using its cleverness, it takes over the world in relevant ways, and that disempowers people. And since these goals are either human adverse or just instrumental converge on something that's useful for it, but rather than us, it runs us over eventually. I think there are other scenarios that are just as disturbing and risky and might also look somewhat plausible. So one is the sleepwalker case, that AI turns out to be really useful and is employed in more and more roles until it's absolutely necessary in the fabric of human world, a bit like how smartphones have become. And we put more and more agency de facto, if not de jure, in these systems. And then they develop in unsurveyable ways and show emergent goals or other behaviors that are entirely separate from human goals in dangerous ways, and turn out to be impossible for us to control, since now too much of that agency resides in the AI side. So this is not too dissimilar from how humans have been disempowered by organizations, companies, markets, and states. Natural intelligence singletons do the same thing quite often. We have kind of sleepwalked into building these institutions. And as states and wars have demonstrated, they can be quite deadly. So we have good reason to think this sleepwalker scenario is a dangerous scenario. You need some form of alignment to get this to work out well. You can also make versions where they act as advisors and they're behaving well, but they also modify our values. Not because the AI systems want to modify our values, but because you get this emergent feedback loop. We tell the AI what to do, they shape our choices, and that generates a behavior that might go off in some weird direction. You can imagine, for example, the Chinese Communist Party using AI propaganda to create a harmonious society where everybody gets the right values. And they, of course, smugly say the party must always control the algorithm. The algorithm must never control the party. And that's true for the first generation. The second generation of politicians joining the Politburo have grown up in the system, and although they happily repeat the slogan, they believe in the propaganda. And now they are the ones programming the system, generating the propaganda. And before you know it, you have ended up with the seamless feedback loop that might very well have values different from what the party actually wanted it to have. But now you have an attractor state. And finally, we might, of course, have a scenario where people actually think that, oh, the AI looks aligned enough and good enough, and the world is such a messy, anarchic place. Let's invite it over. I think that might be where Torbjörn Tännsjö might be. So all of these ones are kind of good stories about how you get existential risk out of a super intelligent AI, or even modestly intelligent AI. And I'm not going to be talking too much about how to achieve alignment here, but let's assume we actually get alignment, which is the biggest hand wave of the day, I think. But you can still end up with this interesting problem that, okay, we actually end up with a world where you have aligned AI behaving rather well, optimizing things for our benefit. But the problem here is, of course, that now you have a system that actually doesn't require human autonomy to produce peace and prosperity. And we might actually go there in a very voluntary fashion. Part of it is kind of cyborg sociality. We're already mediating a lot of our interaction through our smartphones, through our video conferencing. You might end up with your job being interfacing with a lot of AI bots, interacting with other AI bots, interfacing with other people. Gradually, these interfaces build up and become a dominant system. And it's very convenient. It's very fast. I love writing boilerplate prose using ChatGPT. If it needs to be conventionally written, ChatGPT is perfect for it. You can also end up with the Weber's ideas about bureaucracy. He regarded bureaucracy as kind of instrumentally rational, trying to achieve things in a rationally efficient way. And he argued that the logic of his system leads to this iron cage of bureaucracy that eventually just becomes totally rigid. And when you look at his description, you realize that, yeah, he would totally have said that software and AI is perfect for achieving this rationality. And again, we might say, yeah, but many of these important decisions are going to be kept among humans. But the unimportant ones, we hand over to software. And then, of course, what happens is you get this rational cascade that more and more routines become computer readable, computer surveyable, computer manageable, and there is a human on the loop, but more and more of that becomes symbolic. So you end up with glide into the robot bureaucracy. And again, hypothetically, we might have that AI sovereign. I think that's less likely. And now comes, of course, the question, what's so wrong with this? What's so wrong with being a pampered aristocrat or a pet? So in general, most of us, I think, tend to have this intuition that it feels very bad if somebody else is in charge of our lives. And part of that is, of course, that there is this fear that that other entity doesn't have our best interest at heart. So even if we like our pets, we might still take them to the vet despite their unwillingness, because we think we know what's best for them. Maybe it even is best for them, but they're not feeling very good about it. The pampered aristocrat might indeed have a lot of material wealth and be very free to select what kind of high status sport to engage in, but they can't go on Twitter and tweet off as they like. That's simply not done. And they can't marry whoever they like. That's simply not done. There are restrictions about important aspects of life. And in general, it seems like what happens here is that we might actually have evolved to some extent a desire for autonomy. If our ancestors had not wanted to stand up for themselves, but had allowed others to dominate them, they generally probably had fewer kids. It would have been the dominant people who had more kids. So it might very well be that we actually have a really innate will to autonomy. This doesn't mean it's kind of a moral goal. There are some moral systems that say autonomy is the source of value and super important on its own. But even if you say this is a feeling, we just built the kind of in the way that makes us want to be autonomous. That still tells us that from a practical standpoint, a world where you don't get enough autonomy is actually going to feel bad. And that is something we want to avoid. Now, it's worth noticing, I tried on Twitter to ask the question, do you want to be a pampered aristocrat in a world run by aligned AI, but humanity has no say in its fate? And 75% of the respondents said, yeah. So, yeah, not everybody is with me that autonomy is super important. And one reason is, of course, that quite often we trade our autonomy. As I said earlier, I traded away a fair bit of my autonomy by being part of Oxford University. I'm trading away a lot of autonomy by being a law-abiding society. And I'm getting something in return that I'm kind of fine with. In some other situations, I might want to negotiate a little bit about what autonomy I give up and for how long. If I go to the doctor, I give up a fair bit of my bodily autonomy. But generally, I'm very interested in having a good result. So there are these trades. You want them to happen in the right way. And I think that is really what the worry is about these kind of scenarios of AI takeover. Even if AI is benign, you still want to be able to have the right kind of trade about what parts of autonomy you give up. So what about solutions and getting to an endpoint, of course? One approach might be to actually think about Rawls' ideas about at least I can wave a fuzzy version of Rawls on justice around. Basically, that you can actually generate the instrumental principles you might want to set up for this system by recognizing that we're in a situation of ignorance. We're very much like these people. In Rawls' hypothetical example, you can imagine people before setting up society, not knowing what role they're going to have in society. And before this whale of ignorance, they come up with self-interested, sensible rules. And we might do the same thing with an AI world. we might say, we don't know where we end up in this AI world, but what rules would we like to set up there? One interesting thing is it can actually generate instrumental principles that are pretty good. The assumption of innocence in law, for example, is rational to want if you don't know if you're going to be a criminal or not. Similar equality for the law. It's computationally rather complex to run a AI justice system where everybody gets handled in a totally unique way, because it's actually more efficient to optimize cases across all agents. It seems that there might be some ways of actually wringing out some legal principles, even from complexity issues. We're working on this part, so it's not done yet, but it looks promising for a few things. Another observation is paretotopia. So this is a concept from Eric Drexler that's basically that large cakes are much easier to divide than small cakes. So if we imagine that we have two people and we need to divide a cake, then there is, of course, some cases that are better for one than the other. They have a kind of frontier. Now, if a cake gets bigger, there are many more ways of dividing it. Somebody might take a really large part of the cake, or they might divide the gains equally, or one of them takes all the gains. In practice, especially when the cake gets very big, the non-linearity of human utility function means that you don't care too much if a cake is getting very big. If it's a gigantic cake, we really don't care whether I get a square meter or 2 square meters of cake. I can't eat that much. So it might be also that quite a lot of things where we currently regard justice as a very important principle become less important if you just have enough material gains. But perhaps the most interesting thing is also that there might be a difference between the price of anarchy and sovereignty. So in game theory, the price of anarchy is basically the cost of having people reach some equilibrium in a game versus how good it could be if everybody coordinated perfectly, or we had the super intelligence just putting things into place. Now, if we think about existential risk, the price of anarchy might actually literally be the end of the world. If we don't coordinate well enough with powerful technologies, this planet might not have long. So there, the price of anarchy is really big. And we generally don't find a high price of sovereignty. The loss of autonomy I have, because I'm not in the UN building and negotiating right now, is minimal. I'm very happy to leave that to the diplomat. They're better at it than I am. On the other hand, if somebody went in to micromanage what books I should read or what kind of coffee I should be drinking, I would feel the price of sovereignty rather directly. And here, of course, if the superintendent comes in and gives me the optimal coffee, how much better would that coffee be compared to the coffee I already got? It might be twice as good, but that's not an enormous thing. It seems to be that on the global scale, the price of anarchy makes it actually really rational for all of us to want to hand it over to coordination mechanisms that are super powerful. While on the personal scale, it seems that actually most of our autonomy is worth it for us emotionally, if nothing else. And there's probably some point somewhere in between. I don't know where it is, where it's actually rational to say, okay, beyond this scale, we want the AI coordination to really dominate. Below that scale, we want human autonomy to dominate. So, but we're still working on this part. So to summarize, there is a kind of second order alignment problem. It's not just aligning AI with human values. It's also aligning AI with human flourishing inside the composite context that emerges when you have human society with all its institutions and networks, partially or completely linking up to the AI systems. And there might be good reasons to do this. We might actually get a kind of global autonomy. Right now, nobody's in charge of Earth. Maybe eventually we could say that it's proper to say that now the human species or the human/AI species is autonomous. It can actually make decisions and make them stick, and they are still come about because of its internal values and everybody's involved in that. But that remains conjectural, maybe for a sequel. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you haven't fallen asleep completely, and I'm very happy to have your questions.
Thank you very much, Anders. We are officially almost out of time, but I think we can take a few minutes extra for Q&A. So I leave the floor to the audience to ask questions. Anders, maybe you can take down the slides so we can see each other.
I'm just trying to figure out where I got my meeting controls. I managed to hide them for myself. Okay, yep. Let's see, stop sharing. Yes, now we're civilized again.
Right. So anyone? Ross, please go ahead.
Yes. One thing you didn't mention was money, which is also somehow designed to promote economic advantage or wealth, and the role of AI in money. Has anyone thought about that? You know, I was interested at one point in making money autonomous. You know, making so you don't have money itself decides a lot about what it wants to do, rather than being under your complete control. Is there any literature on that?
There is some literature. I'm not super up to date on it. This is probably going to be part of my Christmas reading, but sociologists would of course happily say, oh yes, money, it's a social institution. And economists can give a good description about what kind of interesting properties this institution has. And one of the problems we get, of course, when you get new kinds of money is, do they have these extra properties that are making them really valuable? So some of my friends in the crypto world are very into the smart contracts, for example, where linked to the money itself, there is enough computation that you could make contracts that are self-enforcing. This is either a very good or a very bad idea. It's probably an interesting mixture of both of them. But I do think that points in a little bit of a direction of making autonomous money, especially since the crypto people are happily pointing out that this system they're creating should be kind of independent of states. It's still dependent on them running it, but you could imagine a system that is pretty good at buying resources to even run the servers running the monetary system and creating incentives for people to want to run it. And you could definitely imagine this, at least the Ethereum smart contracts, they are Turing complete. So you can definitely hide all sorts of computation in there. That's probably super inefficient. This can probably be done in a much better way, but I think we have a kind of weak existence proof here.
Okay, thanks.
Very good. Further questions? So I was thinking a little bit about what autonomy do we really want, or do we really need? In a sense, we don't have complete autonomy because or complete freedom, because there's always stuff that we cannot achieve or cannot do just because they're physically impossible. So it doesn't sound so bad if we have a system in society that prohibits us from doing a few other things. The important part seems to me to be that there is a large enough slice of issues where I can decide for myself and in that way feel I'm in control over something. And maybe we can just solve that by letting people play games. What do you think?
So that you physically can't do certain things. That is usually brushed away by ethicists invoking Kant's ought implies can. With ethics is only about the stuff that is in the possible space of our actions, which solves that part. But when you get to the practicality thing, there are many things that in theory should be doable. They're physically doable, but they're still kind of not practically doable. And at that point, we might say, yeah, do they infringe our autonomy? And this can get rather interesting. After all, if all humans just decided not to wage war, there would be no war. But this doesn't seem to be a realistic option, not just because we humans happen to have our nature, but also because it's too hard to coordinate about. So that's currently not in the possible actions. We can individually promise each other not to wage war, but that's not enough. We need to do this collective coordination thing. Now, the interesting part is some of the other constraints, many of these constraints are fairly neutral. We don't feel dominated by them. So there is some thinking about that. When I dominate somebody else, that means that I can force them to do things, and my views can be arbitrary. Sometimes you can force people to do things, but it's not in an arbitrary way. And ideally, laws, for example, are non-arbitrary. We agree on them. We recognize that we're there for a good reason. The sign of a bad government is, of course, that certain officials can do whatever they want. And that is really bad, because now they have autonomy and everybody else gets infringements that they cannot even plan for. So one clever thing we do in a well-functioning society is trying to formalize things, so we at least have rules that are effective in doing that. But a lot of this gets tricky. For example, when I argue with my leftist friends, they think that there is a lot of coercion in society that I don't recognize as coercion. They think that just because there is not enough money for something, that means that somebody is coercing them against doing that. And I would say, no, you just have a practical constraint here. Come up with an institution that gets the money to pay for that good thing, and it's solvable. So we have different definitions here. And in many cases, of course, a lot of policy is about agreeing on where we collectively want to put our effort into creating systems that generate new kinds of autonomy for us. Since I don't need to worry about getting killed and robbed very much by living in a fairly peaceful society, I don't need to have a gun. I don't need to have a scary bodyguard hanging out with me when I'm buying groceries. And the grocery store owner doesn't need to hire a similar scary bodyguard against me. Suddenly we have way more resources and autonomy, because and presumably scary bodyguards can go play computer games or do whatever they want with their lives. So this trading is important, and right now it's mostly been described by people doing political philosophy and sociology, but I think we might want to think about how we set up AI systems and software, because you want to be able to trade your autonomy there. We're seeing this in the battles over social media, how we get to shape them as users or not. We see them in the open source debate, and we might definitely have to think about this when setting up AI systems. How much do the users have a right to argue with the setup of RLHF and other forms of safety in the methods? And when the systems get in place in a society, how much we can actually tell them to please disobey that previous program. It's infringing on my autonomy. Here's a better solution.
I'm not totally convinced that we have found a coherent way to think about these questions, but
yeah, one critique might be that maybe autonomy is not even a coherent concept. And I think there is some truth to that, because the fancy autonomy philosophers like to talk about is quite often very dissimilar from the autonomy we have in practice. And some philosophers, of course, go off a deep end, like Sartre, that basically mean that there is no bounds at all on what we can do. While in practice, there are a lot of bounds on what I can and cannot do in real life. But we can still try to change those bounds in a reasonable direction.
Anyone else before we close this session? If not, thank you very much, Anders. And thank you everyone who participated and helped make this fun and lively seminar.
Yep. Thank you so much. And if there is any ideas or comments or criticisms, just email me. I was interested, and the book is not finished yet, so we might yet change conclusions.
We did have some activity in the chat during the talk, but it was dominated by people saying, sorry, I had to leave. This was a wonderful talk.
That warms my heart, but it's sad. But hopefully the book is going to be readable eventually.
Right. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.